Now, the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, along with the support of Defend Our Democracy, Corruption Watch and the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, demonstrated against the UAE Embassy Pretoria over the release of the Guptas by the UAE government. Let's speak now to Neeshan Balton, who's the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. A very good afternoon to you. Happy Freedom Day. You say you've been demonstrating, doing what the South African government has failed to do. Perhaps talk us through some of your concerns.
No, greetings to your listeners. We expected the South African government to have called in the UAE ambassador and to have issued out what is called a démarche, which essentially would have been an expression of dissatisfaction by the South African government about the way in which the UAE government had handled the case of the Guptas, and more so not notifying the South African authorities in advance of their release, and only doing so 6 weeks after the Guptas had been freed in that country, giving them sufficient time to leave, probably to a country where they have now sought a new refugee status or some kind of a status that gives them residency in Vanuatu, and thus putting them out of the reach of the UAE authorities should they agree to begin to cooperate with the South African government in the near future. And we feel that action on its own warranted the highest level of diplomatic sanction possible, which is a démarche. Initially, DIRCO had indicated that was going to be done.
You were still telling us about what expectations you had on action when it comes to this move by the South African government.
No, sorry, I didn't know I had been cut off. We had expected the South African government to issue out what is diplomatically called a démarche, which is the highest form of expression of dissatisfaction that a government can give to the embassy of a foreign country that has a presence here. And in this regard, that dissatisfaction would have been about the way in which the Gupta's case had been handled by the UAE, and specifically the late communication to the South African authorities that they had been freed. The South Africa was only notified 6 weeks after the Guptas had been released, making it very, very difficult thereafter for follow-up action to be taken. And this wasn't even done in the normal way. The ambassador here merely indicated to our the Department of Justice that he had this document which had some information, and they had to go to the embassy to collect it and then translate it into English, all of which I think is very unheard of in the normal ways in which the diplomatic relations would be conducted.
So given the devastation and, of course, the processes that were mishandled, very evidently so, the devastation caused by the Guptas in South Africa, what are your expectations as you have this demonstration? What are you hoping to achieve, especially when it comes to the responsibility or perhaps accountability by the UAE government?
Well, we hope that through this, that we firstly have drawn attention to what we think are the deficiencies in the relationship between the two countries. I think secondly, from here, the foundation and other organizations will be stepping up pressure on the South African authorities to reinstate aspects of this case, to find ways in which the Guptas can be traced and charges reinstated, because it's only once those charges are reinstated that I think Interpol can be brought back on board and all of the necessary work to find them and bring them back to this country might be possible. In that regard, once I think that those hurdles have been overcome, the cooperation of the UAE would become very, very, very important, because the Guptas have established a number of businesses in that country. They are likely to want to go back there at some point. And should they go back there, we hope that the UAE would have a very different approach towards their apprehension and their rendition back to South Africa through the kind of legal mechanisms that we had hoped would have been in place by now.
What impact do you think this release has had, especially looking at how they're no longer in police custody of the UAE, and observing what effect it has here at home, raising some questions about where this matter stands, South Africa's plans to hold them accountable for state capture? Will that ever happen? What sort of perception do you think it creates in the minds of South Africans?
Well, I think put together the fact that the Nulani case has all but collapsed, the freeing of the Guptas would create an impression that those who were implicated in state capture are more likely to go free, and that the willingness to do what is required to bring them to account perhaps is not as strong as we would have liked it to be. I think, nevertheless, the South African public needs to put on the necessary pressure onto the authorities here to ensure that all of the recommendations of the Zondo Commission are in fact, or will in fact be acted on, and that those who were implicated in it, like the Guptas and others, are not going to get off as scot-free as perhaps they would like to. I think that's the kind of commitment that we should demand, no matter how demoralized we might be by recent events.
As you marched to the UAE Embassy, how were you received?
Well, the embassy security were there. The ambassador obviously wasn't around. There was a huge security presence, very cordial from the South African police and the private security. At the end of it, the ambassador indicated telephonically to the diplomatic police that his staff would not accept a memorandum from us. We, however, will ensure that the memorandum will be sent to him via email tomorrow. This is not the first time, however, that the ambassador has, or that the embassy staff have refused to accept any written document from ourselves. I think this is the second or third demonstration that we've held.
Is there
and
a reason
on all
why?
Occasions, well, that you would have to ask the ambassador. My sense is that they didn't want to be seen in public engaging on this issue. What we found strange was that the logo of the embassy placed on the outside of the walls, once we had arrived there were efforts to cover them up so as not to indicate that that was the embassy of the UAE, when on any given day, if you were driving down that road, you would see that signage. So I couldn't understand the rationale for that, but perhaps there is one that we were not aware of.
Very well. Thank you so much for talking to us about this matter. Neeshan Balton, who is the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, speaking to us there about how they demonstrated at the UAE Embassy over the Gupta saga and, of course, how they were met.